The nurse looked at me with pity in her eyes and said, "Mrs. Torres, I'm sorry, but your emergency contact hasn't answered any of our calls. Is there anyone else we can reach for you?" I lay there in the hospital bed, chest still aching from what the doctors confirmed was a moderate heart attack, and felt something break inside me that had nothing to do with my cardiovascular system. My daughter Carmen had been my emergency contact for 15 years. My son Miguel lived 20 minutes away. My husband Richard worked downtown, barely a half hour from the hospital. Not one of them had bothered to answer the phone when I was fighting for my life at 58 years old. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. I had always been the foundation that everyone else built their lives on. Helen Marie Torres, the woman who remembered every birthday, who showed up to every graduation, who opened her checkbook whenever anyone in the family needed help. For 37 years, I had been the safety net, the problem solver, the one who made everything work. I owned 3 rental properties in Phoenix, had built a successful catering business from nothing, and managed a trust fund worth $2.4 million that would eventually go to my children and grandchildren. I was the matriarch, the provider, the one who held everything together. But lying in that sterile hospital room with machines beeping around me and no familiar face in sight, I realized that all my years of giving had earned me exactly nothing when I needed someone most. The heart attack had started at home on a Tuesday morning. I was preparing tamales for my grandson's birthday party that weekend, the same recipe my grandmother had taught me when I was 8 years old. The pain hit me like a freight train, radiating down my left arm and squeezing my chest until I couldn't breathe. I managed to call 911 before collapsing on my kitchen floor next to a bowl of masa that would sit there, forgotten, for 3 days. The paramedics found me conscious but barely, and rushed me to Desert Valley Medical Center, where they worked for 2 hours to stabilize my condition. When I woke up in the cardiac unit, disoriented and scared, the first thing I asked for was my family. The nurse, a kind woman named Patricia with gentle hands and a soft voice, explained that they had been trying to reach my emergency contacts since I arrived. Carmen, my 34-year-old daughter who lived in Scottsdale with her investment banker husband, hadn't returned their calls. Miguel, my 31-year-old son who worked as a contractor and lived in nearby Tempe, hadn't picked up his phone. My husband Richard, who should have been the first person they called, was apparently in meetings all day and couldn't be disturbed. I spent that first night alone, listening to the monitors and watching nurses check on other patients whose families filled the hallways with worried faces and hushed conversations. No flowers arrived. No concerned relatives camped out in uncomfortable chairs. Just me, Helen Marie Torres, the woman who had given everything to everyone, lying alone in a hospital bed, wondering if anyone even knew I was fighting for my life. The next morning, Carmen finally showed up, but not because the hospital had reached her. She came because her neighbor had seen the ambulance at my house and mentioned it at their yoga class. Carmen walked into my room wearing designer athletic wear and carrying a green juice, looking more annoyed than concerned. She glanced at the monitors, checked her phone, and then looked at me with the same expression she used to wear as a teenager when I asked her to clean her room. "Mom, you scared Mrs. Rodriguez," she said, settling into the visitor's chair like she was doing me a favor. "She called me in a panic thinking someone had died. You could have texted me or something to let me know you were okay." I stared at her, wondering if the medications were affecting my hearing. "Carmen, I had a heart attack. The hospital tried to call you, multiple times." She waved her hand dismissively. My phone was on silent. I was in a meditation retreat yesterday. You know how important my self-care routine is, especially with everything going on at Bradley's firm right now. That was Carmen. Everything was always about her schedule, her needs, her priorities. Even my heart attack was somehow an inconvenience that interfered with her wellness journey. She stayed for exactly 37 minutes, spent most of that time on her phone dealing with what she called a crisis at the country club fundraiser, and left with a promise to check in later that never materialized. Miguel came by that evening, straight from a job site with dirt under his fingernails and concrete dust on his clothes. He looked genuinely concerned when he saw me, which gave me a brief moment of hope that at least one of my children still cared about my well-being. He sat down heavily in the chair Carmen had vacated and ran his hands through his dark hair, a gesture he had inherited from his father. "Jesus, Mom, you look terrible," he said, which wasn't exactly the comfort I was hoping for, but was at least honest. Why didn't anyone tell me this was serious? Carmen made it sound like you just had chest pains or something. I explained what had happened, how long I had been there, how the hospital had tried to reach everyone. Miguel looked genuinely surprised, even pulled out his phone to check his missed calls. "I had 3 calls from a number I didn't recognize," he admitted. "I thought it was spam. You know how many robocalls I get about my truck warranty." We talked for about an hour, and I began to feel a little better. Miguel seemed attentive, asked questions about my treatment, even joked with the nurses. But then his phone rang, and everything changed. It was his girlfriend Stephanie, calling about some emergency with their apartment lease. Miguel stepped out to take the call, and when he came back, he was already reaching for his jacket. "Mom, I hate to do this, but Steph really needs me right now. The landlord is being a total nightmare, and if we don't handle this tonight, we might lose our deposit." He kissed my forehead quickly and promised to come back the next day. "Don't worry about anything, okay? You just focus on getting better. Everything else will work itself out." But he didn't come back the next day, or the day after that. When I was discharged 4 days later, I took a taxi home to an empty house and a kitchen that still smelled faintly of the tamales I never finished making. Richard, my husband of 26 years, didn't show up at the hospital until my 3rd day there, and only because Carmen had finally called him when she realized people were starting to ask questions. He arrived during visiting hours looking harried and slightly out of breath, carrying a wilted bouquet of grocery store flowers, and an expression that suggested this was just another item on his endless to-do list. "Helen, sweetheart, I'm so sorry," he said, settling into the visitor's chair with a dramatic sigh. "This week has been absolutely insane. We're closing the Morrison deal, and you know how demanding those clients can be. I've been in back-to-back meetings since Monday." He looked at me expectantly, as if I should appreciate the sacrifice he was making by taking time away from his precious real estate empire to visit his wife in the cardiac unit. Richard owned a successful commercial real estate firm in downtown Phoenix and had built his entire identity around being indispensable to his clients. In his mind, every deal was crucial, every meeting was urgent, every phone call was more important than whatever personal crisis might be happening at home. Over the years, I had learned not to compete with his work because work always won. But this was different. This wasn't about missing a dinner party or arriving late to a school play. This was about me nearly dying while he was showing office, space to corporate executives who wouldn't remember his name in 6 months. "Richard, I had a heart attack," I said quietly, watching his face for some sign that he understood the gravity of what had happened. I could have died. The doctor said if I had waited even an hour longer to call for help, the damage could have been permanent. He nodded seriously, the way he did when clients explained their space requirements, but I could see his mind was elsewhere. He kept glancing at his phone, checking messages, his leg bouncing with the restless energy of someone who had better places to be. "I know, sweetheart, and I'm here now," he said, reaching over to pat my hand in a gesture that felt more automatic than affectionate. "The important thing is that you're going to be fine. Dr. Peterson says you'll make a complete recovery if you follow the treatment plan. Maybe this is a wake-up call to slow down a little, take better care of yourself." The irony wasn't lost on me. The man who worked 70-hour weeks and hadn't taken a real vacation in 8 years was telling me to slow down. The man who ate fast food in his car between appointments and drank coffee instead of sleeping was lecturing me about self-care. I had been taking care of everyone else for so long that I had forgotten to take care of myself. But Richard's version of taking care of himself involved ignoring everything that wasn't directly related to making money. He stayed for 2 hours, which I suppose was longer than Carmen's 37 minutes, but most of that time was spent on his phone dealing with what he called emergencies that couldn't wait. When he finally left, promising to come back tomorrow, with real flowers from that place you like, I knew I wouldn't see him again until I was discharged. And I was right. The next few days blurred together in a haze of medical tests, medication adjustments, and visits from nurses who seemed more concerned about my well-being than my own family. Dr. Martinez, my cardiologist, was a soft-spoken woman, about Carmen's age, who explained my condition with patience and clarity. The heart attack had been caused by a blocked artery, something that could have been prevented with better diet and exercise, she said, but was also partially genetic. My father had died of a heart attack at 62, something I had mentioned to Richard and the kids multiple times over the years when they urged me to see a doctor about my occasional chest pains. "Mrs. Torres," Dr. Martinez said during one of our conversations, "I have to ask about your support system at home. Recovery from a cardiac event is not just physical, it's emotional. Having family around to help with daily tasks and provide encouragement makes a significant difference in patient outcomes." I looked at her kind face and felt something inside me crack that had nothing to do with my damaged heart. "My family is very busy," I said carefully. "They have their own lives to manage." She nodded, but I could see the concern in her eyes. "Is there anyone who can stay with you for the first week or two? Someone who can help with grocery shopping, meal preparation, medication management?" I thought about Carmen's meditation retreats and country club obligations. I thought about Miguel's apartment drama and construction deadlines. I thought about Richard's endless stream of crucial meetings and indispensable deals. "I'll manage," I said, because that's what I had always done. I always do. But lying there in that hospital bed, watching other patients receive visitors and flowers and balloons, I began to understand something that would change everything. For 37 years, I had been the person everyone else leaned on. Was the one who opened my checkbook when Carmen wanted to redecorate her house, who co-signed Miguel's truck loan when his credit wasn't good enough, who funded Richard's business expansion when the bank wanted too much collateral. I was the grandmother who never missed a recital, the mother who always had room at the table for unexpected guests, the wife who managed the household so efficiently that Richard never had to think about anything beyond his work. I had built my entire identity around being needed, around being the solution to everyone else's problems. But when I needed them, when I was lying in a hospital bed with machines monitoring my heartbeat and doctors discussing my mortality, they were nowhere to be found. Not because they were bad people, but because they had grown so accustomed to my strength that they couldn't imagine a world where I might need theirs. The financial advisor who managed my trust fund, a meticulous man named David Hernandez, called me on my last day in the hospital. He had heard about my condition from Richard, who apparently thought it was important enough to mention when discussing quarterly distributions. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. David's call was professional but warm. The tone of someone who had watched me build my wealth over 2 decades and understood what it represented. "Mrs. Torres, I hope you're feeling better," he said. "I wanted to touch base about the trust fund paperwork we discussed last month. Given your recent health scare, you might want to consider updating your beneficiary arrangements, or perhaps restructuring some of the distribution schedules." It was a routine call, the kind of conversation we had several times a year, but something about his timing made me pause. Here was a man I paid to manage my money, calling to check on my well-being and offer practical support, while my own family couldn't be bothered to return a hospital's emergency calls. "David," I said, "let me ask you something. If something had happened to me this week, if I hadn't survived the heart attack, How quickly could the beneficiaries access the trust funds? There was a brief pause while he processed my question. Well, that would depend on several factors. The trust is structured to provide immediate access to emergency funds for medical expenses or urgent needs. But the larger distributions would require verification of the death certificate and completion of some legal paperwork, probably 30 to 60 days for full access. I thought about Carmen's designer yoga clothes and Miguel's truck payments and Richard's expensive suits and his office lease in the financial district. I thought about how quickly they had all found excuses to prioritize everything else when I needed them most. And if I wanted to make changes to the beneficiary structure, I asked, how long would that take? David's voice became more cautious, probably sensing the shift in my tone. Changes can be implemented fairly quickly, Mrs. Torres. Is there something specific you'd like to modify? I'll call you next week, I said. I think it's time to review everything. When I was finally discharged, I called a taxi rather than ask any of my family members for a ride home. The driver, a chatty man named Jose who had been picking up hospital patients for 15 years, was more concerned about my well-being than the people who shared my DNA. He helped me into my house, offered to carry my discharge papers, and even waited to make sure I could get up the front steps safely. I tipped him $40 and watched him drive away, thinking about how kindness from strangers had become more reliable than love from family. My house felt different when I walked through the door. It was the same Spanish-style home I had lived in for 18 years, with the same tile floors I had chosen and the same family photos covering the walls, but something fundamental had shifted. The silence wasn't peaceful anymore. It was hollow. The rooms that had once felt warm and lived in now felt like a museum dedicated to a family that existed more in memory than reality. I stood in my kitchen, looking at the bowl of masa that had been sitting on the counter for 4 days, now dried and cracked like desert earth. The tamales I had been preparing for my grandson's birthday party would never be made. The party had happened without me, without my homemade food, without my presence. Carmen had texted me a few photos from the celebration, held at some upscale restaurant in Scottsdale, where my 8-year-old grandson Alex had looked confused and slightly overwhelmed by the formal atmosphere. In one photo, Alex was sitting at a table decorated with store-bought balloons and a professional cake that looked beautiful but impersonal. He was wearing the Cowboys jersey I had bought him for Christmas, the one he insisted on wearing everywhere. Despite Carmen's protests that it didn't match his other clothes, seeing him in that shirt, surrounded by expensive decorations but missing the warmth of family tradition, made my chest ache in a way that had nothing to do with my damaged arteries. That night, I sat at my dining room table with a cup of tea and a notebook, writing down everything that had happened over the past week. Not because I wanted to wallow in self-pity, but because I needed to see it clearly, objectively, like a business plan or a budget. The facts were simple and undeniable. When I had faced a life-threatening emergency, the 3 people who should have mattered most had all found reasons to be somewhere else. Carmen had prioritized her meditation retreat and country club obligations. Miguel had chosen his girlfriend's apartment drama over his mother's cardiac crisis. Richard had decided that closing a real estate deal was more important than being present when his wife nearly died. These weren't just mistakes or miscommunications. These were choices that revealed exactly where I stood in their hierarchy of importance, and that ranking was lower than I had ever imagined possible. I thought about all the times I had dropped everything for them. When Carmen was going through her divorce 3 years ago, I had flown to San Diego and stayed for 2 weeks, cooking meals and helping with the kids while she went to therapy and figured out her life. When Miguel's construction business was struggling, I had written him a check for $15,000 to cover his equipment payments and payroll, no questions asked. When Richard's biggest client was threatening to leave his firm, I had used my connections to introduce him to potential replacement clients, even hosting dinner parties at our house to facilitate the relationships. But those memories, instead of making me feel appreciated, now made me feel foolish. I had been so focused on being the person everyone could count on that I had never asked whether anyone would be there for me when I needed them. The answer, it turned out, was no. The trust fund that David Hernandez managed for me was worth $2.4 million, money I had accumulated through years of smart investments, business success, and careful financial planning. It was designated to be divided among Carmen, Miguel, and their children, with some smaller bequests to Richard and a few charitable organizations I supported. The fund was my legacy, the tangible representation of everything I had worked for and built over my lifetime. But as I sat there in my empty house, reviewing the beneficiary documents I kept in my home office, I began to question whether the people listed deserved the security I had spent decades creating for them. Not because they were bad people, but because they had shown me exactly how little they valued the person who had made their security possible. Money I had earned through years of running a successful catering business, managing rental properties, and making wise investments was designated to go to people who couldn't be bothered to answer a phone call when I was fighting for my life. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that my near-death experience had given me something unexpected: clarity. For the first time in my adult life, I had a clear picture of where I stood in my family's priorities. And that picture was devastatingly honest. I wasn't the beloved matriarch whose wisdom and presence enriched their lives. I was the bank they visited when they needed something, the safety net that allowed them to take risks without consequences, the problem solver who managed all the difficult parts of family life so they could focus on their own pursuits. And if that was all I was to them, then perhaps it was time to reconsider what they were to me. The next morning, I called David Hernandez and scheduled a meeting for the following week. I didn't tell Richard or the kids about my plans. I didn't announce that I was reevaluating my estate planning or hint that changes might be coming. I simply made the appointment and began thinking about what I really wanted my legacy to be. Because lying in that hospital bed, forgotten by the people I had spent my life loving and supporting, I had learned something crucial about myself. I was not content to be invisible. I was not willing to be taken for granted. And I was certainly not going to reward the people who had abandoned me with the fruits of a lifetime spent building something they had never bothered to appreciate. For 58 years, I had been Helen Marie Torres, the woman who made everything work for everyone else. But my heart attack had shown me that version of myself was slowly killing me, literally and figuratively. It was time to become someone new, someone who valued herself as much as she had always valued others. The woman who emerged from that hospital room would be different, stronger, more selective about where she invested her time, energy, and resources. The people who had abandoned me at my most vulnerable moment were about to learn that actions have consequences, even when those actions are neglect and indifference disguised as being busy. But first, I needed to heal. Not just from the heart attack, but from the decades of putting everyone else's needs before my own. And in that healing, I would discover exactly how much power I had been giving away to people who had never deserved it in the first place. The weeks following my discharge from the hospital revealed patterns I had been blind to for years, maybe decades. It wasn't just the heart attack that had exposed my family's true priorities. It was their behavior afterward, the careful way they managed to avoid any real responsibility while maintaining the appearance of concern. Carmen started calling every few days, but these conversations followed a predictable script. She would ask how I was feeling, make vague promises about visiting soon, and then quickly pivot to discussing her own life, her yoga instructor's new meditation techniques, the drama at her children's private school, her husband Bradley's latest promotion at the investment firm. These calls felt more like obligation than affection, boxes being checked rather than genuine connection. During one particularly revealing conversation, Carmen mentioned that she had told her therapist about my health scare, as she called it, and how guilty she felt about not being more available. Dr. Whitman says I need to set better boundaries. Between my wellness journey and family emergencies, she explained, her voice taking on the practiced tone of someone repeating therapeutic advice. She reminded me that I can't pour from an empty cup, you know? I have to take care of my own mental health first before I can be truly present for others. I listened to this explanation with growing amazement. Somehow, my heart attack had become an opportunity for Carmen to explore her own emotional needs with a therapist who charged $300 an hour. My medical emergency had been reframed as a boundary issue, something that interfered with her self-care routine rather than a crisis that should have brought the family together. I understand you need to take care of yourself, mija, I said, using the endearment that had always made her smile when she was little. But when your mother is in the hospital with a heart attack, that's not really about boundaries. That's about family. There was a pause, and I could almost hear her mental wheels turning, probably trying to remember something else Dr. Whitman had said about difficult family dynamics. Mom, I think you're being a little unfair, she finally replied. I came to see you as soon as I found out what happened. It's not my fault the hospital couldn't reach me. And honestly, you've always been so independent and strong that it never occurred to me you'd actually need help with anything. This response crystallized something that had been bothering me since the heart attack. My family had used my strength against me, turning my competence into an excuse for their absence. Because I had always handled everything myself, they felt justified in assuming I always would. Miguel's approach was different but equally frustrating. He would show up unannounced, usually when I was resting or reading, full of nervous energy and elaborate plans to make things right. He brought groceries I didn't need, offered to fix things around the house that weren't broken, and generally created more chaos than comfort. It was as if he thought he could erase his absence during my crisis through a series of grand gestures that required minimal actual commitment. One afternoon, he arrived with a crew of his construction workers, announcing that they were going to install new security lighting around my property. I've been thinking about what happened to you, he said, directing his crew toward my perfectly adequate existing lights. And I realized this house isn't secure enough. What if you'd fallen and couldn't get help? What if someone tried to break in while you were recovering? I watched from my kitchen window as 3 men in work boots trampled through my carefully maintained flower beds, installing expensive fixtures I hadn't asked for. Miguel supervised the project with the intensity of someone trying to prove his devotion through visible action, but when I tried to talk to him about what I had actually experienced in the hospital, the fear, the loneliness, the realization that I had been alone when I needed family most, his attention wandered immediately. Mom, don't worry about all that emotional stuff, he said, checking his phone for messages from other job sites. The important thing is making sure you're safe now. Actions speak louder than words, right? This lighting system is top of the chi line. It's going to give you real peace of mind. But I didn't need peace of mind about hypothetical burglars. I needed peace of mind about my family, and no amount of security lighting could provide that. The lights were beautiful and completely unnecessary, costing nearly $4,000 that Miguel expected me to pay for without discussion. When I questioned the expense, he looked genuinely hurt. I thought you'd appreciate the gesture. Mom, I'm trying to take care of you here. The irony wasn't lost on me. He was taking care of me by spending my money on something I didn't want to solve a problem I didn't have, while avoiding the real issue of his absence when I had genuinely needed him. Richard's response to my heart attack was perhaps the most calculated of all. He began treating me like an invalid, not out of concern, but out of what seemed like legal caution. He insisted on driving me to my follow-up appointments, not because he wanted to be involved in my care, but because he was worried about liability if something happened while I was driving. He started asking detailed questions about my medications and treatment plan, not because he cared about my well-being, but because he wanted to document that he was being a responsible husband. The most telling moment came when he suggested I see a lawyer about updating my will. Given your recent health scare, he said, using the same euphemistic language Carmen favored, it might be wise to make sure all your affairs are in order. You know how complicated estate planning can get, especially with the trust fund and the rental properties. His concern wasn't about my mortality. It was about ensuring that my assets were properly protected and distributed according to his expectations. I began to notice how often Richard mentioned the trust fund in casual conversation, always framed as practical concern for our financial security. He would talk about maximizing returns for the family, optimizing tax implications for the kids' inheritance, and ensuring that our legacy was properly protected. But there was nothing collaborative about these discussions. Richard spoke about my money as if it belonged to all of us, as if the decades I had spent building wealth were a team effort rather than the result of my individual work and smart decisions. The rental properties I owned had been purchased with income from my catering business, properties I had researched, financed, and managed entirely on my own. The trust fund had been built through investments I had made using profits from catering contracts Richard had never even known about. Yet, somehow in his mind, these assets had become community property that he felt entitled to manage and plan for. During one particularly uncomfortable conversation, Richard suggested that I might want to consider simplifying my financial arrangements. It's a lot for you to manage on your own, especially now that your health is a concern, he said, spreading papers across our dining room table like he was preparing for a business presentation. Maybe it would make sense to consolidate some of these accounts. Put everything under joint management so I can help you handle the details. I looked at the papers he had organized, copies of my investment statements, property deeds, and trust fund documents that he had apparently been collecting and reviewing without my knowledge. Richard, where did you get all of this information? I asked, feeling a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. Some of these documents are from my personal files. He waved his hand dismissively, the gesture of a man who believed he was being practical rather than invasive. Helen, we're married. Your financial security is my responsibility too. I've just been doing some research to make sure we're optimizing everything properly. But I had never asked him to research my finances, and the fact that he had been gathering information about assets I had built independently felt like a violation of trust that went far beyond casual concern. The children's behavior during this period was equally revealing. Both Carmen and Miguel began mentioning money more frequently in our conversations, always in the context of planning for the future, or expressing concern about my ability to manage my affairs after the heart attack. Carmen worried aloud about whether I was being taken advantage of by my financial advisor, suggesting that someone closer to the family might be better positioned to protect my interests. Miguel offered to help me organize my paperwork and streamline my rental property management, proposing solutions to problems I didn't have. What became increasingly clear was that my family's sudden interest in my well-being was directly proportional to their concern about my wealth. The heart attack had reminded them that I was mortal, and that reminder had triggered not grief or love, but anxiety about inheritance timelines and asset protection. They weren't caring for me, they were caring for their future financial security. This realization hit me with devastating clarity during a family dinner I hosted 6 weeks after my discharge. I had invited everyone over for Sunday meal, hoping that gathering around my table might restore some sense of normal family connection. I spent 2 days preparing traditional Mexican dishes, foods that had always brought the family together, mole poblano that took 8 hours to make properly, fresh tortillas pressed by hand, rice with sofrito that my mother had taught me to prepare when I was barely old enough to reach the stove. The dinner was beautiful. The table was set with my grandmother's china, candles flickered in the crystal holders Richard had given me for our anniversary, and the house smelled like cumin and chocolate and all the spices that had defined my childhood in my mother's kitchen. I had recreated the atmosphere of celebration and abundance that had always marked special occasions in our family. But the conversation that night revealed how much had changed beneath the surface of our family. Dynamics. Richard spent most of the meal on his phone, dealing with what he called a client emergency that apparently couldn't wait until Monday morning. Carmen picked at her food while explaining her new elimination diet and how most traditional Mexican cuisine didn't align with her current wellness goals. Miguel ate enthusiastically but kept checking the time, because he had promised Stephanie he would help her move furniture into their new apartment that evening. The moment that shattered my remaining illusions came when Carmen casually mentioned a conversation she had been having with a financial planner about generational wealth transfer strategies. She had been researching tax implications of large inheritances and wanted to discuss optimizing the family's long-term financial planning to minimize the impact of estate taxes on future distributions. "I've been thinking about your trust. Fund structure, Mom," she said, cutting her mole poblano into precise small pieces that she then pushed around her plate without eating. "Bradley's firm has some really sophisticated strategies for wealth preservation that might be worth considering. The current tax environment is really favorable for certain types of transfers, but that could change if we wait too long." I sat there listening to my daughter, whom I had nursed through childhood illnesses and supported through expensive private schools and college tuition, discussing my money as if it were a business opportunity rather than the result of my life's work. She spoke about maximizing family assets and strategic distribution timing, while barely touching the food I had spent days preparing specifically for her. Miguel joined the conversation with his own concerns about real estate tax implications and property management efficiency. He had apparently been researching the rental market in Phoenix and had ideas about how I could leverage my properties more effectively. "Mom, you're sitting on a gold mine with these rental properties, but you're not maximizing their potential," he said, pulling out his phone to show me spreadsheets he had created analyzing my investment returns. "If you updated the units and raised the rents to market rate, you could probably increase your monthly income by 30%. The properties he was discussing so casually were homes I had saved for years to purchase, buildings I had chosen, carefully in neighborhoods I understood, spaces I had personally renovated and maintained. Each property represented months of research, financial planning, and hard work. But Miguel talked about them like abstract investments, numbers on a spreadsheet that could be optimized for maximum return. Richard eventually put away his phone, long enough to contribute his own thoughts about my financial management. He suggested that I might want to consider moving some assets into joint accounts for simplified estate planning and streamlined management. He had spoken with a tax attorney about strategies for protecting family wealth and had specific recommendations about restructuring my investments for optimal tax efficiency. I listened to this conversation with growing horror, not because their suggestions were unreasonable, but because of what they revealed about how my family viewed me. I wasn't their beloved mother and wife whose life and health they valued. I was a resource to be managed, an asset to be optimized, a financial problem to be solved before it became complicated by emotions or legal obstacles. None of them asked how I was feeling about my recovery. No one inquired about my fears or concerns about future health issues. Nobody mentioned the meals I had prepared or expressed appreciation for the effort I had put into creating a special family gathering. The conversation centered entirely on my money and how to handle it more efficiently. After everyone left that night, I sat alone at my dining table surrounded by plates of food that had barely been touched, looking at the beautiful table setting that no one had commented on, and I felt a sadness that went deeper than anything I had experienced in the hospital. The heart attack had damaged my cardiovascular system, but this dinner had broken something more fundamental, my belief that my family loved me for who I was rather than what I could provide for them. Over the following weeks, I began to notice other patterns that had probably been there for years but had been invisible to me because I was too focused on giving to pay attention to what I was receiving in return. Phone calls from my children almost always included requests for money or favors, usually presented as emergencies or opportunities that required immediate action. Carmen needed help with her son's private school tuition because Bradley's bonus had been delayed. Miguel needed a loan to purchase new equipment for his construction business because interest rates were favorable and he didn't want to miss the opportunity. These requests were always framed as temporary situations, short-term loans that would be repaid quickly once their current financial obstacles were resolved. But I realized I had been hearing these same explanations for years, with different details but the same underlying assumption that my resources existed to solve their problems. I had been subsidizing their lifestyles for so long that they had begun to see my financial support as an entitlement rather than a gift. The pattern extended beyond money to time and emotional labor as well. Carmen would call me for advice about parenting challenges, marriage problems, and career decisions, but these conversations were entirely one-sided. She would talk for an hour about her struggles and concerns, accept my suggestions and support, and then end the call without asking a single question about my life or well-being. I had become her unpaid therapist, someone who provided emotional support without expecting anything in return. Miguel's approach was similar, but focused more on practical support than emotional labor. He would arrive at my house with projects that needed immediate attention, help reviewing contracts for his business, assistance with paperwork for tax filings, support with research for major purchases like vehicles or appliances. He treated my time and expertise as unlimited resources that existed for his benefit, never considering that I might have my own priorities or limitations. Even Richard, who should have been my partner rather than another dependent, had fallen into patterns of taking rather than giving. He expected me to manage all the domestic responsibilities of our household: cooking, cleaning, social calendar management, gift purchasing for his family members, coordination with service providers and maintenance personnel. While he focused on his career and financial goals, I handled everything else that made our life together function smoothly. The emotional labor was perhaps the most exhausting aspect of these relationships. I was expected to remember everyone's preferences, manage everyone's schedule conflicts, anticipate everyone's needs, and provide solutions to everyone's problems. When family gatherings were planned, I was responsible for coordinating calendars, preparing food, organizing activities, and ensuring that everyone had a positive experience. When conflicts arose between family members, I was expected to mediate and resolve the issues without taking sides or causing offense. But this emotional labor was invisible to the people who benefited from it, treated as part of my natural role, rather than work that deserved recognition or reciprocation. My family had become accustomed to my competence and reliability to the point where they no longer saw it as something I provided. They saw it as something I simply was, like having brown eyes or speaking Spanish. The heart attack had temporarily disrupted these patterns, forcing everyone to confront the possibility that their primary source of financial and emotional support might not be permanently available. But instead of using this wake-up call to examine their own behavior and consider how they might contribute more to our family relationships, they had responded by trying to secure their access to my resources more efficiently. I began to understand that my family loved the version of me that served their needs, but they had no relationship with the person underneath that role. They loved Helen the provider, Helen the problem solver, Helen the safety net. But they had never bothered to know Helen the individual, the woman with her own dreams and fears and desires that had nothing to do with what she could do for other people. This realization was more devastating than the heart attack itself because it revealed how profoundly I had failed to protect my own identity over the years. In my eagerness to be needed and valued, I had gradually erased myself, becoming so focused on meeting everyone else's expectations that I had forgotten to have any expectations of my own. But the woman who emerged from that hospital bed was different from the woman who had collapsed in her kitchen while making tamales for people who took her love for granted. This woman was beginning to remember that she had value beyond her usefulness, worth beyond her willingness to sacrifice, and power beyond her ability to give. The first time I said no to one of Carmen's requests, she responded with confusion. That quickly turned to irritation. She had called asking for help with a down payment on a vacation house in Sedona. explaining that the investment opportunity was time-sensitive and that she needed access to funds immediately. In the past, I would have transferred the money without question, happy to help my daughter achieve her goals. Instead, I told her I needed to think about it. "Mom, what do you mean you need to think about it?" she asked, her voice taking on the sharp edge she used when things didn't go according to her expectations. "This isn't a complicated decision. The house is a great investment, and you know Bradley and I are good for the money. We just need access to the funds now while the market conditions are favorable." I explained that I was reevaluating my financial priorities after the heart attack and that I wanted to be more thoughtful about major expenditures. Carmen's response revealed exactly how she viewed our relationship. "I don't understand why you're being so difficult about this," she said. "It's not like you're spending the money on anything important. You just let it sit in accounts earning minimal interest when it could be working harder for the family." The phrase "working harder for the family" crystallized everything that was wrong with our dynamic. In Carmen's mind, my money existed to serve the family's goals, not my own. The idea that I might have my own plans for my resources, or that I might want to maintain control over my financial decisions, was apparently incomprehensible to her. When I ultimately declined to provide the down payment, Carmen responded with a combination of guilt and manipulation that I recognized but had never named before. She questioned my love for her children, suggested that I was being selfish and short-sighted, and implied that my refusal would damage our relationship permanently. "I guess I just expected more support from my mother," she said in a tone that managed to convey both disappointment and accusation. "But I understand if your priorities have changed." Miguel's response to my new boundaries was different, but equally revealing. When I declined to co-sign a loan for additional construction equipment, he became defensive and accusatory. "Mom, I don't understand what's gotten into you lately," he said during a tense conversation in my living room. "Ever since the heart attack, you've been acting weird about money and family stuff. Are you sure the medications aren't affecting your judgment?" The suggestion that my newfound reluctance to fund his business expansion was a symptom of medical impairment rather than a reasonable financial decision showed exactly how little respect he had for my autonomy. In Miguel's worldview, any choice I made that didn't align with his expectations must be the result of illness, medication, or emotional instability rather than legitimate personal priorities. Richard's reaction was the most calculated and concerning of all. When I mentioned that I was reviewing my estate planning and might make some changes to the trust fund structure, he responded with what appeared to be casual interest, but felt like careful surveillance. He began asking more detailed questions about my financial advisors, expressing concern about whether I was getting appropriate guidance for someone in my situation. "Helen, I just want to make sure you're not making any hasty decisions while you're still recovering," he said during one of our increasingly uncomfortable conversations about money. "Major financial changes should probably wait until you're feeling completely back to normal. There's no rush to modify arrangements that have been working well for everyone." But the arrangements had been working well for everyone except me. I had been funding other people's dreams and goals and priorities, while my own resources and autonomy were gradually being absorbed into what Richard called family planning. But what I was beginning to recognize as systematic exploitation of my generosity and sense of obligation. The more I examined these patterns, the clearer it became that my family had developed a sophisticated system for extracting maximum value from my resources while providing minimal support in return. They had learned exactly how to frame their requests to appeal to my sense of maternal duty and family loyalty. They knew which emotional buttons to push when I hesitated to provide what they wanted. And they had collectively created a narrative in which my value was measured entirely by my willingness to sacrifice for their benefit. This system had worked perfectly for years because I had been a willing participant, someone who derived self-worth from being needed and appreciated. But my heart attack had shown me what happened when I actually needed something from them, and their response had been devastating proof that our relationships were fundamentally transactional rather than genuinely loving. The woman who had collapsed, in her kitchen while making tamales for ungrateful family members, was gone, replaced by someone who was finally ready to ask hard questions about what love really meant and whether the people in her life were capable of providing it. The breaking point came on a Wednesday morning in October, 3 months after my heart attack, when I discovered Richard had been forging my signature on financial documents. I had gone to my home office to retrieve some tax papers when I noticed that my filing cabinet had been rearranged. The folders were still alphabetically organized, but they were slightly out of order in a way that only someone who had maintained them meticulously for 20 years would notice. I pulled out the investment folder and found documents I had never seen before. Bank statements showing transfers I hadn't authorized, insurance policy modifications I hadn't requested. Most shocking of all, an application to add Richard as a joint owner on my primary investment account, complete with my forged signature at the bottom of the form. My hands trembled as I examined the signature. It was a good forgery, clearly practiced, but I knew my own handwriting intimately. The way Richard had formed the H in Helen was slightly different from my natural style, and the loop in the T of Torres was too perfect, too careful. This wasn't a one-time desperate act. This was the work of someone who had been practicing my signature until he could replicate it convincingly. I sat in my desk chair for nearly an hour, staring at that forged signature and feeling something fundamental shift inside me. This wasn't about money or inheritance planning or even the heart attack anymore. This was about Richard systematically stealing my identity, my autonomy, my legal right to control my own assets. While I had been recovering from a life-threatening medical crisis, my husband of 26 years had been quietly working to gain control over everything I had built. The bank records showed that Richard had been gathering information about all of my accounts for months, maybe longer. He had copies of statements going back 3 years, photocopies of certificates of deposit, detailed records of my rental property income and expenses. He had been conducting surveillance on my financial life with the thoroughness of someone planning a hostile takeover. But what devastated me even more than the forgery was the realization that this level of deception required long-term planning. Richard hadn't decided to steal my financial autonomy in a moment of panic or desperation. He had been systematically working toward this goal for years, collecting information, practicing signatures, waiting for the right opportunity to implement his plan. My heart attack had simply provided the perfect cover story. Who would question? A devoted husband trying to help his ailing wife manage her complicated finances? I called my bank immediately and spoke with Maria Santos, the branch manager who had been handling my accounts for over a decade. "Mrs. Torres, I'm so glad to hear from you," she said warmly. "Your husband was just in here last week asking about the paperwork for joint account access. He mentioned that you'd been having some health issues and wanted to make sure he could help you manage everything if needed." The calculated nature of Richard's deception took my breath away. He had been building a narrative with my bank, positioning himself as the concerned husband of an incapacitated wife who needed his protection and assistance. "Maria, I need you to listen to me very carefully," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "I never authorized any changes to my accounts. I never signed any paperwork requesting joint access. If my husband submitted any documents with my signature, they are forgeries." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Mrs. Torres, this is a very serious allegation. Are you saying that your husband forged your signature on legal documents?" I looked down at the papers spread across my desk, evidence of Richard's betrayal laid out in black and white. "Yes, Maria, that's exactly what I'm saying." The next few hours were a blur of phone calls, document scanning, and legal consultations. Maria immediately froze all activity on my accounts pending a fraud investigation. I contacted my attorney, Patricia Morales, who had handled my business legal needs for 15 years. Patricia listened to my explanation with the professional calm of someone who had seen every possible variation of family financial abuse, but I could hear the anger in her voice when she spoke. Helen, what Richard has done is not just morally reprehensible, it's criminal, she said. Forgery of financial documents is a felony, and attempted theft of this magnitude could result in serious prison time. The fact that he's your husband doesn't protect him from prosecution for these crimes. She scheduled an emergency meeting for that afternoon and advised me to gather every piece of evidence I could find before Richard realized what was happening. I spent the rest of the morning going through every file in my office, documenting everything that seemed out of place or suspicious. I found evidence that Richard had been accessing my personal computer, probably using it to research my investment. Accounts and financial records. Browser history showed searches for power of attorney forms, spousal financial rights in Arizona, and estate planning for incapacitated individuals. He had been methodically researching exactly how to take control of my assets legally, and when those methods proved too slow or complicated, he had simply decided to forge documents instead. The most chilling discovery was a folder hidden behind other files in my desk drawer, containing photocopies of my driver's license, social security card, and passport. Richard had been preparing to impersonate me or steal my identity if his other plans failed. This wasn't a desperate attempt to help an ailing spouse. This was a comprehensive strategy to steal everything I owned. When Richard came home that evening, he had no idea that his carefully constructed plan had unraveled. He greeted me with the same performance of concern he had been maintaining since my heart attack, asking about my day and offering to help with dinner. I watched him move through our kitchen, opening our refrigerator, using our dishes, and felt like I was looking at a stranger who had been wearing my husband's face for months or maybe years. "Richard, we need to talk," I said, settling at the kitchen table with the folder of evidence I had compiled. "I found some interesting papers in my office today." His face remained carefully neutral, but I saw something flicker in his eyes. Not guilt or shame, but calculation. He was already planning his defense, figuring out how to explain away what I had discovered. "What kind of papers?" he asked, sitting down across from me with the casual demeanor of someone who had nothing to hide. "I hope you're not worried about those insurance forms I helped you organize last month. I was just trying to make sure everything was properly filed." The ease with which he lied was almost more shocking than the forgery itself. Richard wasn't just stealing from me, he was gaslighting me, trying to make me question my own memory and perception. I placed the forged signature document on the table between us. "This isn't about insurance forms, Richard. This is about you forging my signature to try to steal my money." He looked down at the paper with what appeared to be genuine confusion, but I could see the wheels turning behind his expression. "Helen, I have no idea what you're talking about. This looks like a standard bank form. Are you sure you didn't sign this and just forgot about it? The medications you're taking can affect memory sometimes." The audacity of his response was breathtaking. Even when confronted with clear evidence of his crime, Richard was trying to convince me that I was the one with the problem. He was suggesting that my own medications were making me paranoid and confused, that I couldn't trust my own memories or judgment. This wasn't just theft. This was psychological abuse designed to make me doubt my own sanity. "Richard, I know. My own signature," I said, my voice getting stronger with each word. "I know what I have and haven't signed, and I know that you've been stealing from me." He leaned back in his chair, abandoning the pretense of confusion for something more calculating. "Helen, I think you're overreacting to what's essentially a paperwork error. Even if there was some mistake with the signature, my heart was in the right place. I'm trying to protect our assets, not steal from you." The phrase "our assets" revealed everything I needed to know about Richard's mindset. In his view, everything I had earned and built belonged to both of us, regardless of the legal reality or my own wishes. He genuinely believed that my money, was his money. My property was his property, and my financial decisions should be subject to his approval and control. These aren't our assets, Richard, I said, spreading more documents across the table. These are my assets. I earned this money. I bought these properties. I built this wealth. And you have been systematically trying to steal it from me. His mask finally slipped completely, revealing the anger and entitlement that had been lurking beneath his performance of concerned husband. "Don't be ridiculous, Helen," he snapped. "We've been married for 26 years. Everything we have, we built together. Just because the paperwork is in your name doesn't mean I don't have rights here. I've supported your business. I've been a good husband, and I deserve to have a say in our financial future." But Richard's version of supporting my business had consisted primarily of eating the food I brought home from catering events and occasionally bragging to his golf partners about his wife's little cooking business. He had never invested $1 in my company, never helped with marketing or operations, never even offered to assist with bookkeeping or tax preparation. His idea of being a good husband was showing up and expecting me to handle everything else. "You want to talk about rights?" I asked, pulling out my phone and showing him the call log from my attorney's office. "Let's talk about my right not to have my signature forged. Let's talk about my right to control my own bank accounts. Let's talk about my right to press criminal charges against someone who steals from me, even if that someone is my husband." The mention of criminal charges finally got Richard's attention. His demeanor shifted from indignant to calculating, and I could see him trying to figure out how much trouble he was actually in. "Helen, there's no need to involve lawyers in what's essentially a family matter," he said, his tone becoming more conciliatory. "If you're upset about the bank paperwork, we can straighten that out. But involving outsiders in our personal business isn't going to help anyone." This response confirmed what I had suspected. Richard's plan had always included keeping his theft within the family, counting on my loyalty and desire to avoid public embarrassment to protect him from consequences. He had assumed that I would rather be quietly robbed than create a scandal that might reflect badly on our marriage or his reputation in the business community. "This stopped being a family matter when you started forging legal documents," I replied. "Patricia Morales is handling this now, and she's recommending that I file criminal charges. Apparently, what you've done is called financial elder abuse, and it's a felony in Arizona." The term elder abuse made Richard flinch, probably because it carried implications that went far beyond simple theft. Over the next hour, Richard cycled through every manipulation tactic he had apparently been planning to use if his forgery was discovered. He tried anger, accusing me of being paranoid and ungrateful. He tried guilt, reminding me of all the years he had been a loyal husband and questioning how I could destroy our marriage over a misunderstanding. He tried bargaining, offering to fix the paperwork, and promising never to access my accounts again without permission. But the strategy that revealed the most about his character was his attempt to turn my family against me. "Have you thought about how this is going to affect Carmen and Miguel?" he asked, his voice taking on a tone of paternal concern. "If you press charges against me, it's going to destroy their family stability. Do you really want to put your children through the trauma of seeing their father prosecuted? Don't they deserve better than having their family torn apart by your vindictiveness?" Richard was trying to make me responsible for the consequences of his crimes, suggesting that any damage to our family would be my fault for refusing to cover up his theft, rather than his fault for committing it in the first place. He was positioning himself as the victim of my unreasonable response to his reasonable attempt to protect our shared interests. "My children deserve a mother who doesn't allow herself to be robbed," I said. "And they deserve to learn that actions have consequences, even when those actions are committed by people they love." Richard's face darkened as he realized that his usual manipulation tactics weren't working. "Fine, Helen, but if you go through with this, don't expect me to just sit here and take it. I know things about your business that could make your life very complicated if they came to light. The threat was vague but menacing, suggesting that Richard had been collecting information about more than just my bank accounts. I wondered what things he thought he knew and what kind of complications he imagined he could create. But instead of intimidating me, his threat had the opposite effect. It confirmed that the man I had been married to for over 2 decades was capable of far more deception and manipulation than I had ever imagined. "Are you threatening me, Richard?" I asked, my voice calm despite the adrenaline coursing through my system. "Because if you are, I should probably mention that to Patricia when I talk to her tomorrow." He backtracked quickly, claiming that he was just expressing frustration and hadn't meant to sound threatening. But the mask had slipped completely now, and I could see the real Richard, calculating, entitled, and willing to use any tactic to maintain control. That night, I lay awake in the guest bedroom where I had been sleeping since my return from the hospital, staring at the ceiling and processing the magnitude of what I had discovered. Richard's betrayal went far beyond money. He had been systematically undermining my autonomy, my dignity, and my legal rights while performing the role of devoted husband. The man who was supposed to protect and support me had been planning to rob me of everything I had worked my entire life to build. But as devastating as Richard's betrayal was, it also provided a kind of clarity I had never experienced before. For months, I had been questioning my own perceptions, wondering if I was being too sensitive about my family's behavior, doubting my right to expect better treatment from the people who claimed to love me. Richard's forgery was proof that my instincts had been correct. I was being exploited and manipulated by people who saw me as a resource rather than a person deserving of respect. The next morning, I met with Patricia Morales in her downtown Phoenix office, a sleek space with floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the city where I had built my life and my business. Patricia was a woman about my age who had built her law practice from nothing, specializing in protecting women and seniors from financial abuse. She understood exactly what I was dealing with because she had seen variations of the same story dozens of times. "Helen, what Richard has done is unfortunately more common than you might think," she said, reviewing the evidence I had brought. "Financial abuse often escalates when the victim experiences a health crisis that makes them appear vulnerable. Abusers see illness or disability as an opportunity to accelerate their plans because they assume their victims will be less able to fight back." Patricia's clinical analysis of my situation was both comforting and horrifying. Comforting because it confirmed that I wasn't overreacting or being paranoid. Richard's behavior fit established patterns of criminal conduct. Horrifying because it meant that my husband had been studying me like a predator, waiting for the right moment to strike. "What are my options?" I asked, needing to understand the full scope of possible responses. Patricia outlined several approaches, ranging from civil remedies to criminal prosecution. I could file for divorce and seek asset protection through the family court system. I could report the forgery to law enforcement and pursue criminal charges. I could combine both approaches to ensure that Richard faced consequences while also protecting my financial interests. "The most important thing right now is making sure he can't do any more damage," Patricia said. "We need to secure all of your accounts, change all of your passwords, and put legal protections in place to prevent any future unauthorized access to your assets." She also recommended that I consider hiring a private investigator to determine the full extent of Richard's deception and gather evidence for potential criminal prosecution. The private investigator, a former police detective named Carlos Ruiz, discovered that Richard's financial crimes were even more extensive than I had realized. He had been intercepting my mail to access bank statements and investment reports. He had been using information from my personal computer to research my business clients and rental property tenants. Most disturbing of all, he had been developing relationships with some of my professional contacts, positioning himself as someone who could speak for me in business matters. Carlos found evidence that Richard had been telling people in my industry that I was considering retirement due to health issues, and that he would be taking over management of my business relationships. He had apparently been setting the stage to gradually assume control of my catering company, probably planning to use my client contacts and reputation to benefit his own real estate business. Mrs. Torres, your husband has been running a long-term con game, Carlos explained during our second meeting. He's been systematically positioning himself to take over every aspect of your professional and financial life. The forgery was just one piece of a much larger plan. The scope of Richard's deception was staggering, but it also explained some things that had puzzled me over the past year. Why certain clients had seemed distant, why some business relationships had felt strained, why people in my industry had been treating me differently. Armed with this evidence, I made a decision that would have been unthinkable 6 months earlier. I filed for divorce and pressed criminal charges against Richard for forgery and attempted theft. The decision wasn't motivated by revenge or anger. It was motivated by the clear understanding that the man I had been married to was a criminal who posed an ongoing threat to my safety and security. Richard's response to being served with divorce papers and criminal charges was exactly what Patricia had predicted: escalation. He hired an expensive attorney and began spreading stories about my mental instability and medication-induced paranoia. He told anyone who would listen that I was having a breakdown following my heart attack and that my accusations were the result of confusion and family stress. But Richard had underestimated both the strength of the evidence against him and my resolve to see the process through to completion. The bank records were clear, the forged signatures were obvious, and Carlos had documented a pattern of deception that went far beyond a single incident. More importantly, I was no longer the woman who could be manipulated into protecting someone who was hurting me. Carmen's response to learning about her stepfather's crimes was perhaps the most disappointing of all the family reactions. Instead of expressing outrage on my behalf or supporting my decision to seek justice, she tried to convince me to handle the situation privately to avoid damaging the family's reputation. "Mom, I understand that you're upset about the money stuff," she said during a tense phone conversation, "but destroying Dad's career isn't going to solve anything. Can't you just take control of your accounts and move on?" The phrase money stuff minimized felony crimes to the level of household disagreements, and Carmen's concern about Richard's career revealed where her true loyalties lay. She was more worried about potential embarrassment to the family than about the fact that her mother had been systematically robbed by someone she trusted. Miguel's reaction was even more telling. He accused me of being vindictive and suggested that my decision to press charges was motivated by post-heart attack depression rather than legitimate grievances. "Mom, you're destroying our family over paperwork," he said, apparently unable to grasp that the paperwork represented years of criminal planning and attempted theft of my life's work. Both of my children seemed to believe that Richard's status as my husband and their stepfather should protect him from consequences for his crimes. They acted as if family loyalty required me to accept being robbed rather than create conflict by holding a criminal accountable for his actions. Their response showed me exactly how deep the family dysfunction ran. Even criminal behavior was acceptable as long as it didn't disrupt their comfortable assumptions about family roles and hierarchy. But their disapproval, instead of making me doubt my decision, actually strengthened my resolve. If my own children thought I should accept being stolen from to maintain family harmony, then perhaps it was time to reconsider what family actually meant and whether the people who claimed to love me were capable of love at all. The woman who had collapsed in her kitchen 3 months earlier would have backed down, apologized for causing trouble, and found a way to forgive and forget Richard's betrayal. But that woman was gone, replaced by someone who understood that love without respect is just manipulation, that family without boundaries is just exploitation, and that forgiveness without accountability is just enabling further abuse. I was done being understanding. I was done making excuses for people who hurt me. I was done protecting other people's comfort at the expense of my own dignity and safety. For the first time in my adult life, I was ready to put myself first, even if that meant losing relationships I had spent decades trying to preserve. The legal battle that followed would test every assumption I had ever held about family, loyalty, and love. But it would also reveal strengths I never knew I possessed, and open possibilities I had never allowed myself to imagine. Most importantly, it would prove that Helen Marie Torres was nobody's victim. The transformation didn't happen overnight, but once it began, it felt unstoppable. The morning after I filed the criminal charges against Richard, I woke up in my guest bedroom and experienced something I hadn't felt in years, a sense of my own power. For decades, I had been reactive, responding to other people's needs and demands, shaping my life around everyone else's expectations. But now, for the first time since I could remember, I was taking action based on my own values and priorities. My first call that morning was to David Hernandez, my financial advisor, to schedule an emergency meeting about restructuring my trust fund. "Mrs. Torres," he said, his voice careful and professional, "given the recent developments with your husband, I think it would be wise to review all of your estate planning documents. We need to ensure that your assets are protected and that your wishes are accurately reflected in your legal arrangements." David had been managing my investments for over 15 years, and I trusted his discretion and expertise completely. The meeting took place in David's downtown office, a quiet space with warm wood paneling and photographs of his own family prominently displayed. We spent 3 hours reviewing every aspect of my financial life, from the trust fund structure to individual investment accounts to the ownership documents for my rental properties. What emerged from this review was a clear picture of exactly how much wealth I had accumulated through my own efforts, and how much of it had been designated to benefit people who had shown me nothing but disrespect and exploitation. "Mrs. Torres, your trust fund is currently worth $2.7 million, David said, pulling up the most recent statements on his computer screen. "With your rental properties and business assets, your total net worth is approximately $4.2 million. Under the current beneficiary structure, 60% of this wealth would go to your children upon your death, 20% to your husband, and the remainder to charitable organizations and other beneficiaries." I stared at those numbers, thinking about what they represented in terms of years of work, smart investments, and careful financial management. Every dollar in those accounts had been earned through catering contracts I had negotiated, rental, properties I had researched and purchased, business decisions I had made without anyone else's input or assistance. Yet, under my current estate plan, the people who would benefit most from my life's work were the same people who had abandoned me during my heart attack and continued to treat me as a source of funding rather than a person deserving of love and respect. "David, I want to make some significant changes," I said, my voice steady and clear. "I want to remove Richard as a beneficiary entirely. I want to reduce Carmen and Miguel's inheritance to symbolic amounts. And I want to redirect the majority of my assets to organizations and causes that actually align with my values." David nodded thoughtfully, making notes as I spoke. He had clearly been expecting this conversation since learning about Richard's criminal behavior. "Those changes are completely within your rights, Mrs. Torres," he said. "Your assets belong to you, and you have the legal authority to distribute them according to your own wishes. I would recommend that we work with your attorney to ensure that the new trust structure is legally sound and can't be easily challenged." The practical aspects of restructuring my estate plan would take several weeks to complete, but the emotional impact was immediate. For the first time in my adult life, I was making financial decisions based on my own priorities rather than other people's expectations. The new trust fund structure I designed was both a reflection of my values and a statement about what I considered worthy of support. The largest beneficiary would be a scholarship fund for first-generation college students from immigrant families, specifically targeting young women pursuing business degrees. I wanted to help other women like myself achieve financial independence, and build wealth on their own terms without having to depend on family members who might view them as resources rather than individuals. Another significant portion would go to organizations supporting heart disease research and recovery programs for cardiac patients. My own experience in the hospital had shown me how important it was for patients to have advocates and support systems during medical crises. I wanted to fund programs that would ensure other people facing health emergencies wouldn't have to experience the isolation and abandonment I had endured. I also designated funds for legal aid organizations that helped seniors and women protect themselves from financial abuse. Working with Patricia Morales had shown me how expensive it could be to defend yourself against family members who tried to steal your assets, and I wanted to make sure other victims had access to high-quality legal representation regardless of their ability to pay. Carmen and Miguel would each receive $50,000 from my estate, enough to acknowledge our biological relationship, but nowhere near enough to fund the lifestyles they had grown accustomed to subsidizing with my money. The symbolic nature of these bequests was intentional. I wanted them to understand that their inheritance was contingent on their behavior, not their genetics. The process of restructuring my estate plan was surprisingly liberating. For years, I had thought about my wealth primarily in terms of what it could do for my family, how it could solve their problems and provide for their futures. But now I was thinking about what it could accomplish in the world, how it could reflect my values, and create positive change beyond the narrow circle of people who shared my DNA. While the legal paperwork was being finalized, I began making other changes to reclaim control over my daily life. I changed all of my passwords and security codes, ensuring that Richard no longer had access to any of my personal information. I hired a locksmith to rekey every lock in my house and installed a new security system with cameras that would record anyone who entered my property. These weren't just practical precautions. They were symbolic acts of independence, ways of establishing that my home belonged to me and me alone. I also started making changes to my business relationships and social connections. For too long, I had allowed Richard to position himself as my partner or representative in professional settings, letting him attend industry events and speak on my behalf to clients and colleagues. Now I began reaching out to these contacts directly, clarifying that Richard no longer had any role in my business and re-establishing my own professional identity. The responses I received were eye-opening. Several long-term clients mentioned that they had been confused by recent interactions with Richard, during which he had suggested that I was stepping back from active involvement in my catering business due to health concerns. One particularly lucrative corporate client had even started planning to terminate our contract because Richard had told them I was no longer reliable due to cognitive issues related to her heart medication. "Mrs. Torres, I'm so relieved to hear from you directly," said Jennifer Walsh, the event coordinator for a major law firm that had been using my catering services for over 10 years. "Your husband gave us the impression that you were having serious health problems and might not be able to handle large events anymore. We were actually interviewing other caterers because we thought you were retiring." Richard's sabotage of my business relationships was just another form of financial abuse, an attempt to undermine my independence and force me to depend on him for income and professional identity. I spent several weeks rebuilding these relationships, scheduling meetings with key clients to assure them that I was fully capable of continuing to provide the high-quality service they had come to expect. Many of these conversations led to new contracts and expanded business opportunities, as clients expressed relief at being able to work directly with me again rather than through Richard's increasingly unreliable intermediary role. The business rebuilding process also revealed how much Richard had been limiting my professional growth. Several clients mentioned opportunities they had wanted to discuss with me, but had been discouraged from pursuing by Richard, who apparently told them I wasn't interested in expanding my business or taking on new challenges. I had missed out on catering contracts for major corporate events, charity galas, and even a food festival that could have significantly increased my income and professional reputation. One of the most significant opportunities that Richard had Sabotaged was a partnership offer from Maria Gonzalez, a successful restaurant owner who had been interested in collaborating on a line of frozen, authentic Mexican meals for retail distribution. Helen, I tried to reach out to you about this opportunity through your husband about 6 months ago, Maria explained during a lunch meeting in her beautiful restaurant in Old Town Scottsdale. He told me you weren't interested in retail ventures, and that your health situation made it impossible for you to take on new projects. The retail opportunity Maria had wanted to discuss could have been worth hundreds of thousands of dollars in additional income, not to mention the professional satisfaction of seeing my family's traditional recipes reach a wider market. Richard had killed this opportunity without even telling me it existed, apparently deciding that my potential success was less important than maintaining his control over my business activities. I'm very much interested in discussing this partnership, I told Maria, feeling a surge of excitement about possibilities I hadn't even known existed. My health is fine, and I'm actively looking for opportunities to expand my business reach. Over the next hour, Maria outlined her vision for bringing authentic Mexican cuisine to mainstream grocery stores, using traditional family recipes and high-quality ingredients to create products that honored our cultural heritage while appealing to diverse customer bases. The partnership proposal was exactly the kind of challenge I had been unconsciously craving for years. My catering business had become routine, profitable but predictable, limited to the same types of events and clients I had been serving for decades. Maria's retail venture would require me to learn new skills, work with food production facilities, develop marketing strategies, and navigate the complex world of grocery chain distribution. It was intimidating and exciting in equal measure. More importantly, the partnership would be built on mutual respect and shared vision rather than the exploitation and manipulation that had characterized my family relationships. Maria saw me as a valuable partner with skills and knowledge that complemented her own, not as a resource to be managed or controlled. Working with her would mean collaborating with someone who valued my contributions and wanted to see me succeed. As I began exploring new business opportunities and rebuilding my professional relationships, I also started making changes to my personal life that reflected my evolving sense of self-worth. I hired an interior designer to help me redecorate my house, removing traces of Richard's influence and creating spaces that reflected my own taste and preferences. For years, our home had been decorated according to what Richard called investment-grade design. Neutral colors, expensive but impersonal furniture, art chosen for its potential resale value rather than its emotional impact. The new design we created was warm, colorful, and deeply personal. We incorporated Mexican textiles and pottery that reflected my cultural heritage, displayed family photographs that celebrated my relationships with my children and grandchildren, rather than my marriage to Richard, and created comfortable spaces for reading, cooking, and entertaining guests who actually enjoyed my company. The house began to feel like a sanctuary rather than a stage set designed to impress people I didn't particularly like. I also started reconnecting with friendships that had been neglected during my years of focusing primarily on family obligations. My old friend Rosa Martinez, whom I had known since our children were in elementary school together, welcomed me back into her social circle with the warmth of someone who had been waiting patiently for me to remember that I was worth spending time with. "Helen, I've missed you so much," Rosa said during our first lunch together in over 2 years. "I know you were busy with family stuff, but I always hoped you'd find time for your own friendships again." Rosa's comment made me realize how much I had isolated myself from potential sources of support and companionship, choosing instead to pour all of my emotional energy into relationships with people who gave very little in return. Rosa introduced me to a group of women our age who met regularly for book clubs, hiking trips, and cultural events around Phoenix. These women were interesting, accomplished, and genuinely supportive of each other's goals and challenges. Spending time with them reminded me what healthy relationships looked like: mutual respect, shared interests, emotional reciprocity, and the kind of easy companionship that didn't require constant self-sacrifice to maintain. One of the women in Rosa's circle, Dr. Amelia Vasquez, was a retired physician who had gone through her own difficult divorce several years earlier. "Helen, what you're going through is more common than you might think," she told me during a particularly honest conversation about family dynamics and financial abuse. Many successful women find that their families begin to see them as ATMs rather than individuals, especially as they get older and accumulate wealth. Setting boundaries isn't cruel. It's necessary for your own psychological survival. Amelia's perspective was particularly valuable because she had successfully navigated the process of separating her self-worth from her family's approval. "The hardest part is accepting that some people are only capable of loving you for what you can do for them," she said. "Once you understand that, you can stop trying to earn love through service and start building relationships based on genuine mutual respect." These conversations with women who had faced similar challenges helped me understand that my situation wasn't unique or shameful. Many successful women struggled with family members who felt entitled to their resources, partners who tried to control their assets, and children who had never learned to see their mothers as separate individuals with their own needs and desires. The support of these new friendships gave me confidence to continue making difficult changes in my family relationships. When Carmen called to complain about her reduced inheritance, I was able to respond with clarity and firmness rather than guilt and defensiveness. "Carmen, my money belongs to me," I said calmly. "I've chosen to redirect most of my estate to causes that reflect my values. You'll still receive something, but you'll need to build your own financial security rather than depending on mine." Carmen's response revealed exactly what I had expected: anger about losing access to money she had never earned, combined with attempts to manipulate me through guilt and emotional blackmail. "Mom, I can't believe you're punishing us for Dad's mistakes," she said, apparently unable to see the irony in calling Richard's felony crimes mistakes while characterizing my legal response as punishment. "I'm not punishing anyone," I replied. "I'm making decisions about my own money based on my own priorities. If you're disappointed by those decisions, perhaps you should examine why you feel entitled to wealth you didn't create." The conversation ended with Carmen hanging up on me, but instead of feeling guilty about the conflict, I felt relieved. For the first time in my adult life, I had stood up for my own interests without apologizing or backing down. Miguel's reaction to learning about his reduced inheritance was similarly revealing. He accused me of being manipulated by lawyers and advisors, and suggested that my decision-making was impaired by grief over my marriage and medications for my heart condition. Like Richard, Miguel seemed incapable of accepting that a woman might make financial decisions based on her own rational analysis, rather than emotional instability or outside influence. "Mom, you're not thinking clearly about this," he said during a tense conversation in my living room, surrounded by the new decorations that reflected my personal taste rather than his expectations. "You've worked your whole life to build wealth for your family. Why would you want to give it all to strangers instead of to your own children?" Miguel's question revealed the fundamental misunderstanding that had poisoned our relationship for years. He believed that my life's work existed primarily to benefit him and his sister, that my achievements were valuable mainly for what they could provide to future generations of our family. "Miguel, I worked my whole life to build wealth for myself," I said, looking directly into his eyes. The fact that I planned to share it with family was a gift, not an obligation. When family members steal from me, lie to me, and abandon me during medical emergencies, they lose the privilege of receiving gifts from me. The clarity of this explanation seemed to shock him. He had apparently never considered that his inheritance was contingent on his behavior, that love and support needed to be reciprocal to be sustainable. The conversation that followed was difficult but necessary. Miguel tried various tactics to change my mind, promising to be more attentive in the future, arguing that Carmen's behavior shouldn't affect his inheritance, even threatening to contest the will if I went through with my plans. But his efforts only confirmed that his primary concern was access to my money, rather than repair of our relationship. Miguel, if your main worry is losing inheritance money, then you've proven exactly why my decision is correct, I said, as he prepared to leave my house in frustration. A son who truly loved his mother would be concerned about her happiness and well-being, not about his future financial benefits. He left without saying goodbye, but his departure felt like freedom rather than loss. Over the following weeks, I began to understand that the process of setting boundaries with my family was essentially a sorting mechanism, separating people who were capable of respecting me from those who were only interested in what I could provide for them. The people who responded to my new boundaries with anger, manipulation, or threats were revealing that their previous expressions of love had been contingent on my continued willingness to sacrifice my own interests for theirs. But there were also surprises. My grandson Alex, Carmen's 8-year-old son whom I adored, showed up at my house one afternoon with a handmade card and a slightly wilted bouquet of flowers he had picked from his school playground. "Grandma Helen, Mom said you were sick and sad, so I wanted to make you feel better," he said, presenting his gifts with the serious solemnity of a child who understood that something important was happening but couldn't quite grasp the adult complexities involved. Spending the afternoon with Alex reminded me that family relationships didn't have to be transactional or manipulative. His love was simple, unconditional, and focused on my well-being rather than what I could do for him. Playing board games and making cookies together felt like the kind of family connection I had been trying to create with the adults in my life. Mutual enjoyment, shared activities, genuine affection expressed through presence rather than presence. "Alex, do you love Grandma Helen?" I asked as we cleaned up flour from our cookie-making project. "Of course I do, Grandma," he replied without hesitation. "You're the best cook in the whole world, and you always listen to my stories about school." His reasons for loving me had nothing to do with money or inheritance or what I could provide for his future. He loved me because I paid attention to him, because I made him feel valued and heard, because our time together was fun and meaningful. The contrast between Alex's uncomplicated affection and his mother's calculating approach to our relationship was stark and heartbreaking. Carmen had somehow learned to see relationships as investments that should provide measurable returns, while her 8-year-old son still understood that love was about connection, attention, and mutual enjoyment. I decided that Alex would be an exception to the dramatic changes I was making to my estate plan. I established a separate education fund for him that would cover his college expenses and provide some financial support as he built his adult life. But this fund would be managed by trustees who would ensure the money was used for his benefit, rather than redirected to his parents for their own purposes. The legal mechanisms Patricia Morales helped me create were designed to protect Alex from the family dysfunction that had poisoned relationships among the adults. His education fund would be completely separate from Carmen's inheritance, managed by an independent trust company, and structured to provide support for genuine educational and career development rather than lifestyle subsidies. "Mrs. Torres, what you're creating for your grandson is really beautiful," Patricia said as we reviewed the trust documents. "You're giving him financial security, while also protecting him from the family dynamics that have been so harmful to your other relationships. This structure ensures that he'll benefit from your generosity without becoming dependent on it or entitled to it." The education fund for Alex became a template for how I wanted to use my wealth, supporting people I loved in ways that encouraged their growth and independence, rather than their dependence on me. The scholarship funds for first-generation college students were based on the same principle, providing opportunities for people to build their own success rather than simply giving them money to spend. As the legal paperwork for my estate plan revisions neared completion, I felt a sense of satisfaction and empowerment that I hadn't experienced in decades. For the first time since I could remember, my financial decisions were aligned with my values. My resources were directed toward causes I believed in, and my wealth would be used to create positive change rather than enable dysfunctional family dynamics. The woman who had collapsed in her kitchen while making tamales for people who took her for granted was gone, replaced by someone who understood her own worth and was willing to protect it. The woman who had been abandoned in a hospital bed during a life-threatening emergency had discovered that she didn't need the approval or affection of people who were incapable of genuine love. Most importantly, I had learned that my value as a person wasn't determined by what I could provide for others, but by who I was when I wasn't trying to earn anyone else's approval. Helen Marie Torres was nobody's victim, nobody's ATM, and nobody's backup plan. She was a successful businesswoman, a generous philanthropist, and a woman who had finally learned to put herself first. The final papers were signed on a bright December morning, 3 months after Richard's criminal trial had concluded with his conviction on multiple felony charges. As I walked out of David Hernandez's office with copies of my new estate plan, I felt like I was stepping into a completely different life, one where my resources reflected my values, my relationships were based on mutual respect, and my future belonged entirely to me. The justice I had been seeking came not with a dramatic courtroom scene or tearful family reconciliation, but with a quiet phone call on a Tuesday morning in January. Patricia Morales called to inform me that Richard had agreed to a plea deal that would result in his conviction on forgery and financial fraud charges, along with restitution payments for the money he had attempted to steal and the business opportunities he had sabotaged. Helen, he'll serve 18 months in minimum security prison and 5 years of probation, Patricia explained, her voice carrying the satisfaction of someone who had successfully protected her client's interests. More importantly, he's agreed to waive any claim to marital assets and will pay you $150,000 in damages for the business opportunities he destroyed. The divorce will be finalized next month with a complete separation of assets. The financial compensation was meaningful, but the real victory was Richard's public acknowledgement of his crimes. For months, he had been spreading stories about my mental instability and medication-induced paranoia, trying to convince anyone who would listen that I was an unreliable woman making false accusations against a devoted husband. The plea deal was his legal admission that every charge I had brought against him was true and justified. "There's something else you should know," Patricia continued. Richard's attorney mentioned that he's been having difficulty finding employment since word of the charges spread through the real estate community. Apparently, commercial clients don't want to work with someone convicted of financial fraud. His business is essentially finished. The destruction of Richard's career was a consequence I hadn't specifically sought, but it felt like appropriate justice. For years, he had undermined my professional relationships and sabotaged my business opportunities while building his own reputation in the real estate industry. Now he was experiencing the same kind of professional isolation and financial uncertainty he had tried to impose on me through his criminal behavior. The most satisfying aspect of Richard's downfall was how completely it exposed the character, flaws that had always existed beneath his polished exterior. When facing consequences for his actions, he had shown himself to be exactly what I now understood him to be: a manipulative person who believed rules didn't apply to him and who was willing to destroy other people to protect his own interests. During the sentencing hearing, Richard's attorney had tried to portray him as a devoted husband who had made poor decisions under stress, a narrative that completely ignored the calculated long-term nature of his crimes. But Judge Martinez, a woman who had built her career prosecuting white-collar crime, saw through these attempts at manipulation immediately. "Mr. Torres, what you did to your wife represents a particularly cruel form of betrayal," Judge Martinez said as she handed down the sentence. "You exploited her trust, undermined her autonomy, and attempted to steal the fruits of her life's work. The fact that you committed these crimes against someone who depended on you for support makes them especially reprehensible." The judge's words felt like public vindication of everything I had experienced but struggled to articulate during the months of gaslighting and manipulation. Carmen and Miguel had both attended the sentencing hearing, sitting in the back row of the courtroom with expressions of barely concealed resentment. Neither of them had spoken to me since learning about their reduced inheritances, and their presence at Richard's sentencing felt more like a protest against my decisions than support for justice. After the hearing, they left without acknowledging me, apparently unable to reconcile their loyalty to Richard with the overwhelming evidence of his guilt. Their reaction confirmed something I had come to understand about family dynamics and enabling behavior. Carmen and Miguel weren't angry about Richard's crimes. They were angry about the consequences of those crimes, particularly the consequences that affected their own financial expectations. They would have preferred that I quietly absorb the theft and betrayal rather than create complications that disrupted their comfortable assumptions about inheritance and family wealth. But their disappointment no longer had any power over me. The woman who had spent decades seeking approval from people who were incapable of appreciating her was gone, replaced by someone who understood that respect had to be earned through behavior, not demanded through genetic connection or marriage certificates. The weeks following Richard's sentencing brought a kind of peace I hadn't experienced in years. My house, now completely redecorated to reflect my own taste and free from any trace of Richard's presence, felt like a sanctuary where I could finally relax without constantly anticipating someone else's needs or demands. I could read for hours without interruption, cook meals I actually wanted to eat, listen to music that reflected my own preferences rather than background noise that wouldn't interfere with someone else's television viewing. The silence that had once felt oppressive now felt luxurious. I could spend entire evenings in my garden, tending to plants I had chosen because I loved them rather than because they would impress visitors. I could take long baths without worrying about whether someone needed the bathroom for more important purposes. I could go to bed when I was tired and wake up when I felt rested, without adjusting my schedule to accommodate anyone else's preferences. Most importantly, I could make decisions based on my own values and interests without having to consider how those choices would affect other people's comfort or convenience. When I decided to take Spanish classes at the local community college, I didn't have to justify the time commitment to anyone. When I chose to volunteer at a literacy program for immigrant women, I didn't have to explain why I wanted to spend my time helping strangers rather than family members. The Spanish classes were particularly meaningful because they connected me to parts of my identity I had neglected for years. Growing up in a bilingual household, I had been fluent in both English and Spanish, but decades of living with Richard, who spoke only English and showed little interest in my cultural background, had gradually eroded my comfort with my native language. Taking classes with other adult learners reminded me how much of myself I had sacrificed to fit into relationships with people who didn't value the full spectrum of who I was. The literacy volunteer work connected me to women whose stories reminded me of my own mother's experiences as a young immigrant trying to build a life in a new country. Many of these women were incredibly intelligent and capable people who simply needed help navigating language barriers and cultural differences. Working with them reminded me that strength and resilience came in many forms, and that helping people develop their own capabilities was more valuable than simply giving them money. One of my students, a woman named Isabella, who had moved to Phoenix from El Salvador to escape domestic violence, became particularly important to me. She was about Carmen's age but had a work ethic and determination that my daughter had never developed. Isabella attended every class despite working 2 jobs and caring for 3 young children, and she approached each lesson with the focus of someone who understood that education was her pathway to independence. "Mrs. Torres, you make me believe I can really learn this," Isabella told me after a particularly challenging grammar lesson. "My husband always told me I was too stupid to speak English properly. But you show me that I just need practice and patience." Isabella's comment reminded me how often people used language and education to maintain power over others, and how transformative it could be when someone provided support instead of criticism. Working with Isabella and the other women in the literacy program gave me a sense of purpose that was completely different from the obligation-driven activities that had filled my previous years. I wasn't helping these women because they were family members who expected my support. I was helping them because they were working hard to improve their lives and deserved encouragement. The gratitude they expressed felt genuine rather than entitled, and their progress felt like shared victories rather than one-sided sacrifices. My business partnership with Maria Gonzalez had also flourished beyond my most optimistic expectations. Our line of authentic Mexican frozen meals had been picked up by 3 major grocery chains in Arizona and was expanding into New Mexico and California. The success of our products validated my belief that there was a market for high-quality, culturally authentic food that honored traditional recipes while meeting modern convenience needs. More importantly, working with Maria reminded me what healthy professional relationships looked like. She valued my input, respected my expertise, and treated me as an equal partner whose contributions were essential to our shared success. When we disagreed about marketing strategies or product development decisions, we discussed our different perspectives openly and reached compromises that reflected both of our priorities. The financial success of our partnership was significant. My share of the profits was already approaching 6 figures annually and projected to grow substantially as we expanded into new markets. But the personal satisfaction was even more valuable. I was building something new and meaningful with someone who appreciated my skills and creativity, proving to myself that my best years weren't behind me but potentially still ahead. "Helen, I have to tell you something," Maria said during one of our quarterly business review meetings. "When I first approached you about this partnership, I expected we would work well together professionally. But I never expected to find such a wonderful friend. You've taught me so much about business strategy and relationship building." Maria's friendship had become one of the most rewarding aspects of my new life, a relationship based on mutual respect and shared goals rather than family obligation or financial dependence. The success of my business ventures and volunteer work had also attracted attention from other organizations that were interested in my skills and experience. I had been invited to join the board of directors for a nonprofit organization that provided business mentoring for women entrepreneurs, and I was being considered for a position on the advisory council for a foundation that supported educational opportunities for first-generation college students. These opportunities represented exactly the kind of recognition and respect I had been seeking from my family, but had never received. The people who wanted to work with me valued my intelligence, my experience, and my ability to contribute meaningfully to important causes. They saw me as someone worth listening to rather than someone whose primary function was writing checks or solving other people's problems. The contrast between these new relationships and my family dynamics was stark and illuminating. The people who appreciated my contributions were those who had earned the right to my time and energy through their own behavior and reciprocal respect. The people who felt entitled to my resources were those who had never bothered to understand or value what I had to offer beyond money. During this period of growth and new opportunities, I received several attempts at reconciliation from Carmen and Miguel, but these efforts revealed that nothing fundamental had changed about their understanding of our relationships. Carmen sent flowers on my birthday with a card that said, "I hope we can put this behind us and go back to being a normal family." Miguel called to suggest that we agree to disagree about the inheritance issue and focus on rebuilding family unity. Both of their approaches completely ignored the underlying problems that had led to our estrangement. They wanted to return to previous patterns, without acknowledging the harm those patterns had caused, or making any changes to their own behavior. They were essentially asking me to pretend that their abandonment during my heart attack and their subsequent focus on inheritance money had never happened. "Carmen, we can't go back to being the family we used to be because that family was dysfunctional," I explained during one of her attempted reconciliation phone calls. "If you want to build a new relationship with me, you need to start by acknowledging how your behavior has affected me and showing me that you're capable of treating me with respect." Carmen's response was predictably defensive, suggesting that I was holding grudges and being unnecessarily difficult. "Mom, I think you're overthinking this whole situation," she said. her voice taking on the patronizing tone she used when she thought I was being unreasonable. Families have conflicts sometimes, but we work through them and move on. You're turning a temporary disagreement into a permanent rift, and that's not healthy for anyone. Carmen's characterization of systematic financial abuse and family abandonment as a temporary disagreement showed exactly why reconciliation was impossible without fundamental changes in her perspective. Miguel's approach was similarly superficial and self-serving. He wanted to schedule a family dinner where we could hash everything out and get back to normal, but his definition of normal was the same exploitative dynamic that had characterized our relationship for years. He couldn't understand that I had no interest in returning to a version of normal where my value was measured by my willingness to fund other people's priorities. "Miguel, there's nothing to hash out," I told him during one of his reconciliation attempts. "I've made my decisions about my money and my relationships based on how people have treated me. If you want a different kind of relationship with me, you need to show me that you're capable of different behavior." His response revealed that he still viewed the situation as a negotiation about inheritance money, rather than a reckoning about respect and family dynamics. The most telling aspect of both Carmen and Miguel's reconciliation attempts was their continued focus on restoring access to my resources, rather than repairing emotional damage. Neither of them apologized for abandoning me during my medical emergency. Neither acknowledged that their primary concern about my heart attack had been its impact on their inheritance timeline. Neither expressed genuine interest in my well-being or happiness independent of what I could provide for them. Their inability to understand what genuine reconciliation would require confirmed that I had made the right decisions about my estate planning and relationship boundaries. People who were incapable of acknowledging harm they had caused were also incapable of changing their behavior to avoid causing similar harm in the future. But there was one family relationship that continued to bring me genuine joy and hope. My grandson Alex had started visiting me regularly, often brought by his other grandmother who seemed to understand that maintaining his relationship with me was in his best interests regardless of the adult conflicts in our family. These visits reminded me that love could exist without conditions or calculations, and that some family connections were worth preserving despite the dysfunction of others. Alex had started helping me in my garden, learning to plant seeds and water vegetables with the enthusiasm of a child who was discovering that food didn't just appear in grocery stores. He asked thoughtful questions about how plants grew, why some flowers bloomed at different times, and whether the tomatoes we planted would taste better than the ones his mother bought at the store. "Grandma Helen, why do you like gardening so much?" he asked one afternoon as we harvested peppers from plants we had started from seeds. "Because when you take care of something and give it what it needs, it grows into something beautiful and useful," I replied, thinking about how the metaphor applied to relationships as well as plants. "And because it feels good to create something that feeds people and brings them joy." Alex's presence in my life represented the possibility that family relationships could be based on genuine affection and mutual enjoyment, rather than obligation and exploitation. His love was uncomplicated, his company was genuinely pleasant, and his future was something I wanted to support because I cared about his happiness and development as a person. The education fund I had established for Alex was structured to provide him with opportunities while also teaching him about responsibility and gratitude. The trust would pay for his college education and provide some support as he established his career, but it also required him to maintain good grades, perform community service, and demonstrate that he was using his advantages to contribute positively to the world around him. "Alex, do you know that Grandma Helen has saved money to help you go to college someday?" I asked during one of our gardening sessions. "Really?" he said, looking up from the carrot seeds he was carefully planting in. "Rose, that's so nice of you, Grandma. I'm going to study really hard so I can be smart like you." His response captured exactly the attitude I hope to encourage. Gratitude combined with personal responsibility. Appreciation for opportunities combined with commitment to earning them. As spring arrived and my garden began producing the vegetables and flowers Alex and I had planted together, I felt a sense of completion and satisfaction that had nothing to do with money or inheritance or family drama. I had created something, beautiful through my own efforts, shared that creation with someone who appreciated it, and contributed to the growth and development of a child who might carry forward the best values our family had to offer. The woman who had collapsed in her kitchen while making tamales for people who took her for granted had been replaced by someone who understood the difference between love and exploitation, between family and dysfunction, between generosity and enabling. Helen Marie Torres had learned to value herself as much as she had always valued others, and that transformation had freed her to build the kind of life she actually wanted, rather than the kind of life others expected her to provide. My story wasn't a fairy tale with villains punished and relationships magically healed. It was something more realistic and ultimately more satisfying. The story of a woman who had learned to protect her own dignity, honor her own values, and create meaning through relationships and activities that reflected who she really was, rather than who other people needed her to be. The justice I had found wasn't delivered by courts or family reconciliations, but by the simple act of refusing to accept less than I deserved and building a life that reflected my own worth. Sometimes the best revenge is living well, and sometimes the greatest victory is learning to put yourself first. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.